Hello, my name's Nye and I'm studying for an environmental history PhD at the University of Manchester in partnership with the Lancashire Wildlife Trust, looking at the history of chat moss from 1500 through to 1800. Chat moss was massively reduced in size over hundreds of years through partial drainage and reclamation, which reduced it to a shadow of its former size. Astley moss in the north and Caddishead and Little Walden in the south are the remaining fragments of what was once one sprawling peat bog. This map, produced in 1786, shows the extent of Chat Moss before the major attempts to drain it in 1801. Chat Moss sat above the confluence of the rivers Irwell, Mersey and Glaze, and is bordered on the north by Moss Brook. These watercourses helped to form the basin in which Chat Moss originally formed. They also provided a convenient natural drainage system for the gradual and piecemeal drainage of small areas of moss which took place prior to 1801. Now, contrary to whatever you may have seen on TV, bog history isn't all fast cars and glamorous parties. Environmental historians like myself also spend a lot of time in the archives. The records of the local manorial courts, who operated at the lowest level of agricultural dispute resolution, can provide an insight into the distinctiveness of managing the mosslands. Diving into the court records, we see a number of mossland-specific offices and practices. Chief among these were the Moss Reeves. These were officers appointed by the manor with specific jurisdiction over the mosslands. A legal mechanism known as the Moss Room was key to how the manor courts understood the mosses. So, as many of you will already know, the mosslands were often exploited for peat. Peat is what mosslands are made from. It's effectively highly absorbent, partially decomposed plant matter, which helps to keep bogs watertight. Also, when it's been dried, peat can be used as a fuel, and has been exploited in this way for millennia. Now, the local manor courts managed the cutting of peat on the mosslands in a way very different from our modern understanding of ownership. Rather than owning some of the moss and digging the peat from there, commoners instead had the right to dig peat on an allocated portion of mossland, known as a moss room. Many of the dividing lines of commoners' moss rooms survive today, as behind us in this line of birch. So this differed from ownership. Locals did not have the right to convert their moss rooms for agricultural use, and once they'd finished extracting the peat, they had to backfill the moss rooms, at which point ownership often reverted to the lord of the manor. Because of the excessive amount of water on the mosslands, the drainage system that was used to drain the moss rooms was of paramount importance and one of the key functions of the Moss Reeves. Moss Reeves would survey the mosslands, reporting on tenants who had failed to construct adequate drainage ditches for their moss rooms. They would then be fined by the manor court. Other functions of the Moss Reeves included reporting on tenants who had failed to backfill their moss rooms, as well as reporting on people who took peat from the mosses without license to do so.
Now I know what you're thinking. We've done all the boring legwork. When's this guy finally going to talk about ditches? Well, the wait is over. We're now going to talk a little bit about how Chat Moss was drained in the 18th century. We're standing just off Rindle Road. In the 18th century dialect of Lancashire, Rindle means ditch or watercourse. The road was likely named for these ditches, which run alongside it northwards, carrying water away from the mosslands towards Moss Brook, from which the water is then conveyed to the Glaze River. Okay, so behind me is the confluence of the Rindle ditches where they finally meet Moss Brook. From there, Moss Brook takes the water west where it meets the Glaze, which moves south and joins with the Mersey, taking all of the water out to sea. Now this is really useful because it shows how the local topography of Chat Moss, i.e. the fact that Moss Brook is lying just there, really helped them in terms of effecting small, piecemeal drainage over time.
As historians, we can date these ditches using maps which were produced at the time. A plan of Astley Common and Chat Moss shows the point at which the Rindle ditches and Moss Brook meet. Traditional satellite photography sometimes struggles to show these ditches. However, we can use Lidar imagery to uncover similarities between the historical landscape and the landscape as it exists today. Lidar images are made by firing lasers from an aeroplane as it flies over a stretch of ground, which then records topographical information about the land. This Lidar image was taken from data produced by the Environment Agency as part of their National Lidar program. It clearly shows the bridge over Moss Brook here, as well as this straight ditch conveying water from the Rindle ditches to the Moss Brook. These can be compared with the plan from 1765. The easternmost boundary of plot 62 corresponds perfectly with the modern day situation of the ditch. This helps us to date the ditch, giving some insight into how water was conveyed off the early modern mosslands. Specifically, it shows how useful Moss Brook was in the drainage of piecemeal areas of moss. So why should anybody care? Well, by uncovering how the distinctive drainage mechanisms, both physical and administrative, operated on the unique mossland landscape, we can uncover something about the relationship between nature and the societies which live on it. Secondly, when the Wildlife Trust want to reintroduce a species to the mossland, they have to provide evidence that that species did live on that landscape historically. My work in the archives can provide that. Finally, what my work is doing is it's recovering some of the importance of these landscapes, which unfortunately was lost with them a couple of hundred years ago. However, the Lancashire Wildlife Trust are working to reinstate that importance and recover these landscapes.